and welcome to tonight's episode of the Dead Astrologer Society. I'm Donna Woodwell, and I am your host for the evening. I am an astrologer here in Austin, Texas, and I am with two spectacular guests tonight. We have Joseph Crane, who is the author of the work Astrological Roots, the Hellenistic Legacy, and Enid Newberg, who is the president of Kepler College. We are going to be talking about exactly that, Hellenistic astrology, and what that word means, and how it impacts how we do astrology today. This is episode number 14, so if you're counting and you missed the other 13, I highly recommend that you go to our host network, paramaniaradio.com, and check them out and download them later. But without further ado, we are going to start talking about where astrology comes from. So, Joseph and Enid, how are you tonight?
Hello.
Good.
Glad to be here.
It is an exciting round. And you know how it works because you've both been guests before. We have an informal discussion for our audience of mostly non-astrologers who are interested in learning more. So I'm so excited, and thank you so much for coming tonight. So we talked about this ahead of time. Let's start with Joseph. So what exactly does the word Hellenistic mean?
Well, let me first clear up something. Do you remember when you studied world history in like the 6th or 8th grade for the first time, and maybe you ran across the word Hellenistic? You don't remember.
Is that a rhetorical question, or are you actually asking?
No, I'm asking you.
Do I remember? I remember in 8th grade memorizing a lot of words in history books and spelling them out in order to get A's.
Okay.
And that was it.
Okay. Well, at that time in my life, I was really into that stuff. And we called Hellenistic, excuse me, the time after Alexander the Great conquered Greece and everything else. And then all of a sudden, the next chapter was about the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's actually a mistake, because the Hellenistic civilization, you could say, began with Alexander the Great, but it continued through the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about Hellenistic astrology, we're talking about probably a 600 or 700 year continuous tradition that basically went from 100 BCE until the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. So it's a long tradition, and this is when a lot of Western astrology was established.
And when you say Western astrology was established, what do you mean by that?
Well,
for our sun sign reading listeners,
the fundamental things that astrologers look at in the natal chart, in the chart at the moment that you were born, from the place you were born, was pretty much set. So, for the most important thing was astrologers talk about the rising sign. You know, I have Libra rising, you have Sag rising.
Oh, you have such a good memory.
All I remember is that Virgo in the 10th. And it turns out that the ascendant sign has to do with what was going on the moment you were born in the East. And so that became the cornerstone of what the astrological chart. The word horoscope that everyone knows is actually taken from the word for ascendant, or the place that was rising in the East. From that, you have planets and their meanings that were established. You have elements and modes, and you have aspects and all kinds of things that astrologers like to fight with each other about. They were pretty much all established then. Rulership was established, so the toolbox was pretty much created between the years maybe 150 BCE and 450 BCE. Right, AC, I'm sorry. So that's what I mean, the foundation. The technical things that astrologers do, at least in terms of natal astrology, were established. As well as how to do predictive work. That was also established pretty much. Although there are some things that modern astrologers do that ancient astrologers would never have heard of. And there are some things that ancient astrologers do that modern astrologers should do more of. In that that's a different topic.
We'll get to that in the second half of the show.
Yeah.
So, who were some of the players involved in this process, and where were they coming from?
Okay. Excuse me, I've got something in my throat. The best known historically of the people who influenced the people from the Hellenistic tradition who influenced later astrologers was, of course, Ptolemy. And Ptolemy wrote about everything and knew everything. And he wrote about geography and harmonics, and he wrote about astronomy and the stars, but he also wrote a book on astrology that has a lot of the factors that I have listed above explained in a very, I wouldn't call it succinct, but very methodical way. The other person who lived at the same time was named Vettius Valens. And his work was only recently translated, although Ptolemy's been with us all along. Valens was a practicing astrologer, and he collected techniques, and he supplies charts, and you really feel like you're an apprentice to a master when you read his book. Ptolemy is more theoretical. Those are the two big names. There are others. Dorotheus was beforehand. A guy named Paul from Alexander was afterwards. Firmicus Maternus was an Italian, a Roman, who wrote in Latin. In the Hellenistic tradition, almost all the astrology books were written in Greek. So that's one major determining factor.
As opposed to being
In Latin,
Romans who were influenced by the Hellenistic civilization who were writing in Latin.
correct.
And so, in what context was astrology being practiced? I mean, today, most people know of astrology because they pick up a newspaper and they see a horoscope column. What were the Greeks doing?
Oh, they were doing a wide range of things. There were people who were popular astrologers who did something like sun sign astrology, and they would do very simple kind of divinations. There were nobles, merchants, all kinds of people who were in the middle class who used astrologers to help set timing for, let's say, going on a voyage, or to get some kind of objective reading on their kids. There was a large range of natal and predictive astrology that was done. Of course, the Roman emperor would have his astrologers. Not every Roman emperor did, but some did. And divulging the birth chart of the Roman emperor is a crime punishable by death, because if you had his chart, you could tell when he was going to die. They also had astrologers who were more inclined toward magic, who were more inclined toward spirituality, who were more theoretical. So if you look at the range of Hellenistic astrology, it's identical with modern astrology. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I find really useful and sometimes hilarious is how astrologers have not changed over the millennia.
Well, it's kind of like you have your street corner diviner read your horoscope, cast
right.
cast the bones, and then the person who has the whole,
right, same thing. And I'm sure they have astrology schools, and there are the established ones and the fledgling ones, and astrologers clearly fought with each other because you see some of that in Valens, and it's all good-natured fun. Except if you get executed by the Roman Empire. Or Or from time to time, the astrologers would be exiled. And then to be let back when there was a new regime. So,
no, I haven't heard about any astrological exiles lately, so I suppose, well, unless you count being booted from an organization or a Facebook forum.
That's different.
Kind of like an exile.
I'm talking about being sent out of your city.
Yeah. I think we had most of that in the earlier 1900s where it was... Right. But, one of the things, too, that you didn't mention that I do find interesting is it's not only the techniques of astrology that were established through this period, but also the arguments, fate, free will. Because if you listen to those dates that Joseph was talking about, you've also got the rise of Christianity, and you have a whole other set of arguments because especially in the Greek, you have a whole lot of various philosophical points of view getting tied up in the astrology.
Yeah, one interesting thing, and this differentiates Hellenistic astrology from Vedic astrology, and they're actually very close cousins, and they've probably most of them formed at the same time, is that in India, there was a strong alliance between astrology and their spiritual traditions. In the West, there was an alliance not with the spiritual traditions or the religious traditions, but the philosophical traditions. Christianity really had nothing to say to astrologers because they thought the world was going to end during most of the time that Hellenistic astrology was around. And they really didn't care. There were some religious trends like Mithraism that clearly had an astrological component. But what's interesting is how astrologers really spoke the language of our contemporary philosophy. They were interested in the Platonic tradition and the Stoic tradition, and so you're going to get questions of determinism, of what is the relationship, the causal relationship between configuration in the sky and what happens on Earth, and what do the planets and signs mean up there ontologically as opposed to what's happening down here, which seems to be much more chaotic. Seems.
What? Like the zodiac is the realm of the Platonic forms. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah.
I shouldn't. I'll save that for the seminar and not for the radio.
Okay.
But you know me, you're the first one who accused me of being a Neoplatonist, so. That was a long time ago. Anyway, so back on topic. You mentioned the wide plethora of the types of astrology being practiced. Now, the wide plethora of the types of astrology being practiced today, when you walk into a conference, involves everyone sitting in front of their laptops or their iPads, calculating charts, because they have precise birth times because someone recorded them. Now, I would imagine, in the day and age we're talking about, there are two main differences, is that it's not like there were clocks on every wall where you could write down the times things happened, and there certainly weren't, computer-generated vertical market software apps that magically make maps of the sky of any point in time with hardly a thought. So how did that work?
Let me help. Let me try to be real concrete about this. First of all, there were kinds of clocks. There weren't mechanical clocks that we would know, but they did have water clocks, they did have sundials. You could get an approximate sense of the time, enough so that they would have planetary hours. So they often could get things within a certain range, clearly not the same range as we moderns can get. And so we do have birth charts that are timed, and we compared what they say in terms of when a person is born and what the computer says, and they're similar. They had tables of planetary positions, like astrologers today would have an ephemeris, and they didn't look up at the sky every time they did a reading, but they knew where the planets were, And they were actually quite remarkably accurate, considering that they didn't have any of the technology that we have. Then what they did is they had something like a chessboard, and you'd have these little stones that would represent the planets, and the grid would be like the houses of a chart. And they'd put these sort of players around this pattern, and they would do their reading. And it would be pretty easy to come up with an ascendant if you knew approximately the time of birth. And so also people who were interested in astrology, they would certainly know the time of their kid's birth, just like people would these days.
And we do have that hint of a very sophisticated timekeeper too, with the Antikythera mechanism that they've replicated.
Absolutely.
Right.
And what's that, Enid?
Off
the coast of Rhodes.
Leading question.
They found this incredibly rusted piece of metal and couldn't figure out what the heck until they started doing some sophisticated x-rays and other ways of getting into what was really there. And they have now actually built a model of this thing. And it turns out to be a very credible working planetarium that puts the planetary positions quite accurately.
Right.
So for all the conspiracy theorists who like tuning into Paramania Radio, it's an astrological device.
Or it could have been a navigational device as well.
Or it could have been checking out when the aliens were landing.
One thing that's we sort of have this prejudice because we live in a scientific age and because people back then didn't have the kind of science that we do, that somehow they were naive or possessed by strange ideas, or maybe some of them weren't all that bright. The more that's certainly true of the modern times as well, but the more you go back and study what these people actually did, the more you realize how brilliant they were. And that it is clearly within the scope of their intellect to come up with an amazing amount of technology that would apply to astronomy and to astrology. And they particularly wanted to do that because they wanted to be able to judge conditions of life. They took an interest in the stars so that they could do astrology. And it's actually quite remarkable the kinds of achievements that people had.
No, I think you make an excellent point there. I think we are so prejudiced, there's no other word for it, that somehow because we live in the 21st century that we are, quote, more evolved than the people who lived 2,000 years ago. And considering the accomplishments that they made, beautiful temples and sculptures and all kinds of things with limited technology, their ability to think is quite remarkable and perhaps unparalleled in some of our circles, where the beer and pizza just shows up at the door, and so you don't really have to worry about how it got there.
Right. Well, one other factor, and I don't want to say this in any way in the modern world of astrology, but in ancient times, astrology was so valued that you had some really brilliant intellects working at it, and some very philosophically sophisticated people. And I would like the astrological world of the modern time to approach some of the quality of the intellect that we have in the ancient world.
Modern astrologers have it so remarkably easy compared to you didn't have people who didn't have some fairly good, strong background doing astrology because you had to know the mathematics, you had to know the astronomy, you had to know all kinds of pieces to put it together and be effective at it.
However, these are human beings too, and when you read Valence and he's going through various calculations, it's really obvious that he's bored out of his mind. He's going through this stuff because he has to, and his students aren't picking it up, so he has to explain everything in teensy bitty detail, and there's some scribe slavishly writing down the whole thing from the master's breath. So we do have features of my astrological training as well.
There is that.
You mentioned while you were talking that we have had Ptolemy's translations for a while, but the Vettius Valens ones are recently new. So what exactly does that mean?
Oh, well, until the mid-90s, these were available in the Greek. Some were translated into German or Italian. Very little into English. In the mid-90s, Project Hindsight began to systematically translate a lot of this material, and they did a very good job. Other people have sort of carried the ball since then. There's another translation of Valence, whose author escapes me. It's free on the internet, interestingly.
Riley.
Mark Riley, thank you. My friend Dorian Greenbaum did a retranslation of Paulus Alexandrinus. There's a recent translation of Firmicus Maternus, which is much better than what I cut my teeth on 20 years ago. There's just a lot more of this stuff available. The difficulty is that it is not written in modern, succinct English.
Although we do have one translator who's done an attempt at that.
Yes.
Andy Garrett's her work.
Yeah. And much of the Hellenistic, the primary texts of Hellenistic astrology, can be fairly dense going. You have to study. You can't just read it like a popular astrology book. And the reason I wrote Astrological Roots was because I had studied this material, I felt, sufficiently, and I was afraid that it was going to become lost. And I wanted there to be an account of Hellenistic astrology for people who are interested in doing astrology. However, nothing replaces sitting down with a notebook and some time in your hands and going through some of this material. And it's really a wonderful experience. But you have to take it very slowly and systematically. And it helps to have a teacher as well.
And on that note, we are going to take a quick break for a few minutes when we continue to talk about this new scholastic endeavors in astrology and translation of the ancient Hellenistic work, and continue our conversation with the lovely Enid and Joseph. So we'll be right back. And welcome back to tonight's episode of the Dead Astrologer Society, where I am speaking with Joseph Crane and Enid Newberg, and we're talking about Hellenistic astrology, where astrology came from. So welcome back, y'all. Glad you came back from the break. So where were we, Joseph and Enid? We were talking about new scholarly translations in astrology. So let's back up a little bit for our audience and give them a little bit of a context that astrology came down from the Greeks, but there were sort of changes along the way. Give us a short version of how we got from the Greek version of astrology to today.
Okay.
Greek goes to Latin, goes to Arabic, goes to Latin, goes to various other is.
Okay, really simple. In roughly 476, the Western Roman Empire went down. Okay? However, before that, literacy had declined, science had declined, astrology had declined as well. It was just a really tough time. And so in the West, for hundreds of years, there was no astrology. In the East, things were more interesting. First of all, the Eastern Roman Empire continued Hellenistic astrology, but the areas to the east and south were the Persians, and the Persians had sort of developed their own astrology, and they had made some contributions. Now, in the 8th century, in the 7th century actually, Islam took over much of what we call the Middle East, except for the Eastern Roman Empire. They were very interested in the Greek inheritance, and they translated Ptolemy, and they translated Dorotheus. I don't know if they translated Valens, but they established an astrological tradition of their own. That's the one that over the following centuries was imported to the West. As the West has sort of got their act together more, they were more prosperous, there was more time for scholarship, and they began to translate from the Arabic into Latin what would come to us as modern astrology. Now, this astrology has some of the basic features of Hellenistic astrology. They have a different house system called a quadrant system. They use planets applying and separating in a much more focused way than the Hellenistic astrologers did. But that's kind of the time, that's sort of how things evolve. So that's about 700 years and about a minute and a half. That's what happened.
The detailed version of my story.
Yes.
Which is essentially, in a certain way, not too far from the truth, that when you start having translations of translations, it's a little bit like that game of telephone.
Sure.
As a kid where somebody's, you give a message and by the time it's made its way all the way around the circle, it may or may not still be what the actual original message was.
Right.
And that is something that in the new translation that's happening today, astrologers are running across and starting to try collect, they call it, what is it? Oh, no, my mind just went blank as to the master version anyway, where you collect as many different translations as you can to try and make one
like
coherent.
a concordance.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is not the work of ordinary astrologers. Ordinary astrologers meet with clients and they work with mundane events. However, it's very important for these people to make available to us some of the astrological technique and thinking of the past, because that can only make us better as modern astrologers. Yes, Donna.
I was going to say, so it sounds like that until the 20th century, we had a certain kind of an astrology that was an inheritance of sort of Greek filtered through Arabian tradition and, came back together in some interesting ways in the Renaissance. Magic went out of favor, astrology went out of favor, all of those things went out of favor, and we by the 20th century, we didn't have a lot left to go on from some of these ancient traditions. Would that be about right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think what had happened was the traditions of astrology became somewhat oversimplified at the beginning of the age of science, we'll call it, or the so-called Enlightenment, and so not very well understood. in the 20th century, obviously astrology became much more diverse and much more dynamic and much more interesting, and people went in a lot of different directions. And I'm sure the previous segments of your program has a lot of different ways that astrologers have come to think about what they do in modern times. And part of that has been to look back at, actually began in 1986, when there was a reissue of an astrology book by a guy named William Lilly. That astrology became very interested in what did people do in medieval times and during the Renaissance and during ancient times. And so looking back to ancient astrology is a natural development of the growth of astrology in the modern world. There's also work done to identify the original tradition of Indian astrology, as well as the granddaddy of them all, Mesopotamian astrology. But
and
yes.
In conjunction with its renewed interest in discovering the astrological roots, so to speak, of our traditions, we also had the birth of schools like Kepler College that were encouraging the scholarly approach. As you say, this isn't something that all astrologers do in their spare time, because it requires some academic training and rigor of thinking, ability to translate, a whole different set of toolkits than just your average person or even average astrologer would necessarily have at their disposal.
Right. And there's something that really bears, saying once or twice or three times. That you do not have to be a scholar to be a good practitioner of astrology that's influenced by Hellenistic or medieval traditions. There's a supposition that you have to know everything about Aristotle and Greek, and if you're studying medieval astrology, you have to know everything about 13th century Italy. That's not true. What scholars do, or also people like me, is try to make some of these things available for people, and they can carry the ball themselves in whichever way they want to.
And part of this too is what's interesting is how these old techniques are coming in and getting looked at with new eyes. Because the other part that often gets forgot is whatever the astrology is from a different period, it's suiting the needs of the people of that time, of the culture in which it's developed and been working in. So sometimes, we don't have a lot of astrologers today who are busily spending hours and hours in the charts trying to find time of death. It's just not the same kind of concern to modern astrologers.
Right.
But they may be using some of the techniques for starting a war to look at the stock market.
I don't know. We must be awfully obsessed with Pluto. Sorry.
They were obsessed with Pluto long before that planet was discovered.
I was going to say it's too much Disney Channel.
Wrong Pluto. That's what Pluto was named after.
No, actually, there is a story that Pluto was named after, but actually it's which Pluto was named after which. It looks like the dog actually might have got the planet before the planet got the dog.
Yes.
Sorry, this is astrological in humor at this point. Sorry. What were you going to say, Enid?
Oh, I was just going to say, or the snidness that you often find too in astronomers as they play with the naming of various bodies out there. I do find it funny that the Star Trek fans never did succeed in getting the last name of Pluto's moons to be Vulcan.
I love astronomers. I was out at McDonald Observatory a few years back, and, they have a great big glass window where you can see into some of the working telescopes when you're on one of the tours, walking in those little side hallways. And they have a little sign on the front placard that says, "Do not feed the astronomers." I always want to put a sign on our radio show that says, "Do not feed the astrologers." Do it after midnight, bad things happen. So, okay, so in this translation movement, how has this shifted and changed modern discussions about astrology?
Well, there's in one sense it's been fabulous. In another, it's bringing up some interesting divisions because you have people reading some of the old materials and getting to really understand it and looking at modern astrologers and saying, you're all wrong. You have modern astrologers who are looking at, and why are you going back to the old stuff? We have been developing new techniques, and why, they're new and modern. They're really good. And so, in some sense, it's been wonderful. In another sense, the divisions that have tried to establish themselves have been kind of disconcerting to my perspective. Yeah, we've already got plenty of people who want to make noises about astrology. We don't need to do it to ourselves.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm also a big believer in productive chaos, and that there has to be a way for different people of different stripes to communicate with each other. One of the misconceptions is that if you practice an astrology influenced by tradition, that you are a deterministic, outer event-oriented astrologer completely. And that's just not true. What's interesting is the astrology that I've developed is a modern astrology. It just uses a lot of traditional material.
And there's some the philosophy that was so embedded in the traditional astrology is also, there's some amazing stuff in there. And like a lot of modern astrology is really concerned with, well, they call it soul-centered astrology or talk about the soul a lot, but it's seeking meaning. And it's incredible rich tradition that we have behind us because this isn't something new. Astrologers have been, rummaging in these areas for 1,000 years now.
A couple
at least.
Yes.
Hey, you don't have to tell me. I'm the closet astrotheurgist here.
Then you can't be in the closet if you're talking.
I just say it on the radio.
You're out of the closet.
I'm out of the closet. Yes,
out of the closet.
For those who don't understand what those words mean, I just said I was the equivalent of a little starry pagan priestess that does talk to planets. So, many of our modern concepts, they all come back. I mean, humans, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The wheel goes around, and back we go to where we were. As you said, many astrologers fought back when, and they fight today.
And some of the truths that people came up with thousands of years ago are still true.
Mm-hmm.
And, we haven't changed that much since then. And so it's often the case that, it's interesting. I often suggest to people who are interested in learning astrology, do learn astrology and study some other stuff too. If you're interested in literature, see if you can apply literature. If you're interested in philosophy or science. And it's interesting that because of my interest in ancient astrology, I've had to study and sometimes go back again to some of the philosophy that I studied in college. And it's been a really wonderful experience because it gives me the full package of what the ancient world has to offer to the modern world. And if you remember, when people tend to rediscover ancient wisdom, what a renaissance.
You know, there's a great book. I don't know if you have read it, either of you. It was written by Donna Woodwell a few years ago, and it's called The Happiness Hypothesis. And in the book, he approaches the perennial philosophy, the philosophy that appears over and over again in different cultures in different forms, from the perspective of modern positive psychology. And what he's doing is showing all the ways that science and the positive psychology movement, which is all about recasting a psychology as how people can feel happy and successful and even blissful in their lives, instead of pathologizing everything in a nutshell. And show how this relates to what the ancient Greeks thought, the Stoics thought, some Hindu thought and Chinese thought. And it's a fascinating romp on 10 different points through history and how it relates to today. I find it should be one of those books that should be required reading for all astrologers because as a sideline, it has such a rich history that explains where some of what we do and where it comes from. The other book I'd highly recommend if astrologers could ever get a hold of it is the work of Pierre Hadot, who is a French philosopher. He looks at all of the ancient philosophies, especially the Hellenistic areas, his specialty, and recasts them and retranslates them as if they are practical, not just theories and high-minded academic discourse about the nature of the universe, but practical applied philosophies and a way people live their lives.
Oh, absolutely.
And he talks about philosophers as like little groups of communes of, a group of people that had, like, they would go out in the market and do something absolutely weird. Just like, the Dead Poets Society. That they went out and they would, Robin Williams, like, character would turn everything on their head and get everyone marching after him. The same kind of feeling that I got from reading the book were some of these societies of philosophers. And it really wasn't until the Middle Ages and the Christian church and all of these things kind of divorced the idea of philosophy as a scholastic thing that was talked about in your head from the practical side of it. And I really appreciated these Hadot's books because they did kind of fill in the blank, understanding that Stoicism and Epicureanism and those kinds of things were a lived thing. They were a practice, and people like Marcus Aurelius were keeping journals as a way to watch themselves and what was going on in their heads. They just happened to be writing it down, just like we would if we were keeping a journal.
For a while, I got all my relatives for a Christmas present books by Stoics. but if you don't think this ancient practical philosophy is relevant, just pick up a book, pick up Aurelius or pick up Epictetus, and just read it for 20 minutes. And if you're not moved by that, then you have a problem. And importantly, this is the same kinds of things that astrologers were reading in the ancient in the ancient world. They're reading the same kinds of things. Although Aurelius and Epictetus were not particularly interested in astrology, people who are interested in astrology read these people. And it's very important stuff. I could go on.
Yes, I know. We could just go on for hours, and it would be like PBS instead of Paramania. Be fun for me. Fun for us. All right. So we only have a few minutes left because, as usual, the hour flies by. Anything last words that either of you would like to add before we have to close up for the evening?
Turning from chatterboxes to sudden silence when you ask that question is pretty good.
Works that way.
No.
Yeah. I will actually, I guess the only thing I would say is I will recommend or endorse your recommendation for the Hadot book, because I've found that really fascinating.
Yeah, he has two of them. One of them is What is Ancient Philosophy, and the other one is Philosophy as a Way of Life, I think. For people who like that kind of bathroom reading.
Yeah.
That's exactly where I have my copy.
Sounds like fun.
It is fun. It is fun.
It is.
And of course, I highly endorse your choice of medieval authors because Dante is my favorite, and I read it multiple times in great books voluntarily because my instructor was so brilliant. He was one of those men, he spoke 14 different languages, and he would run around the room. His name was Ralph Williams, bless his heart. He would run around the room and start ranting in a foreign language at odd intervals. And people who weren't even in the English department would go to his lectures. He won the best professor of the University of Michigan over and over again because he was so brilliant and human and brilliant. And one day, I will send you a link.
University of Michigan, so that's quite the honor.
Yeah, seriously, he was amazing. I will find a link for Ralph Williams. I'm sure he's given lectures that have been recorded before he died, and I'll send you it because he was amazing. And if his Dante lecture is available, it's certainly worth a listen.
Sounds like fun.
Yay! So, okay, both of you, I've got to wish you goodbye for the evening. So why don't you take a few minutes and tell us about how our audience can get a hold of you.
Enid, you begin.
Alrighty, well, it's pretty easy. Just go to Kepler, KEPLER.edu. And we have classes, we have free lectures, and all kinds of stuff for people interested in astrology.
Great resources. Awesome. Go visit Kepler.
And I'm at astrologyinstitute.com, and I have a monthly newsletter in which I show how ancient and modern astrology can combine quite nicely. Also, if you're interested in the books I've written, just Google me at Amazon, but I'm not the guy who writes about angels. There's another guy named Joseph Crane who writes books about angels, but that's not me. I'm the other guy.
You're the Dante guy and the Hellenistic.
The Dante and astrology guy.
Right. Oh, and Joseph and I are going to be doing some workshops on astrology and the soul throughout all these ages.
Yes.
That actually should be really lots of fun.
Yes.
So how do people find those? Enid?
It will be advertised up on the site actually pretty soon. It's not there right now, but it will be in another week or so.
And in my newsletter, my poor Facebook friends are going to be sick of it.
So you can check out the Kepler website, the Kepler Facebook page. There is a place on the Kepler website you can join the mailing list. You have an email directly to your door, like beer and pizza. And bite-sized little pieces. Yummy Astro Bites. There is a name of a column for you right there. Yummy Astro Bites.
I like it.
It's dinner time in the East Coast. Thank you.
All right. Our wonder producer is telling me we have 1 minute left, so I will need to bid you all adieu for the evening. I am your host, Donna Woodwell of the Dead Astrologers Society. You can find us on Facebook at Dead Astrologers Society or on Twitter at just plain old Dead Astrologers. I am an astrologer in Austin, Texas, and my personal website is www.fourmoonsastrology.com. I hope you will check us out. Stay around next week. We are going to be talking about... Oh, please don't shoot me if I'm wrong, and I don't have my piece of paper here. I think we're talking about music of the spheres. We're doing astrology and music, and we have some fabulous musicians coming on. We have Carlos Cedillo, who does astrological music from a Mayan perspective. We have Will Morris, who's studying music and Chinese astrology, and we have Adam Gainsbourg, who does soul music and plays the Tibetan bells and some other amazing things. So it should be really fun, and I hope we rock the house. So until then, I will see you next week. Come on back. Thank you to our brilliant guests. Thank you, Isa. Thank you, Joseph. Thanks you to all the people who listened. We will see you next time.